Yeah, the session, 3 women, 3 Africas. It's Maaza Mengiste, Nadifa Mohamed, and Taiye Selasi. Virtually, maybe she'll be with us. The session, and we have Shil Caldicat from British Council. She will be introducing the session, and we will try to proceed with the session as best as possible.
Thank you very much. And good morning, or early afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this session in the Mogul Tent. I'm very, very pleased to be introducing this session, 3 women, 3 Africas, and as you can see, we've got 2 women on the stage and 1 woman by Skype. Hi, thank you so much, because we know that you haven't been feeling very well, and it's great that you've been able to join us by Skype. Fantastic, thank you. So, I'm representing the British Council, and I just wanted to say how pleased and proud we are to have been involved with the Jaipur Literature Festival since the very beginning in 2006. And I think it's absolutely fantastic to see how much it has grown so that it's now the largest literary festival in Asia. So congratulations to everyone and to the audience for helping to make that the case. I'm sure you know about the work of the British Council. Literature is one of the planks that we use to deliver cultural relations, and it's very important in our work here in India. We also work through our libraries. We collaborate with educational and cultural institutions. We engage writers. We talk to publishers, producers, translators, and other professionals across literature. And if you look to your left, you will see that there's a British Council stand where you can find out much more about our work, and particularly about our library's work. So this year we're particularly pleased and proud because we're hosting the best of young British novelists from the grantor list. 20 altogether, of which 9 have been touring in India. And 2 of them are here today. Nadifa is one of the 20, and so is Taiye. So congratulations to you both, and I would like to hand over to all 3 of you for an interesting and lively debate on 3 women, 3 Africas. Thank you very much.
Hello everyone. Maaza and I were just discussing how much of an unusual discussion this will be, but we will try our hardest to make it as interesting as possible.
Yeah.
We're just to the side of you, Taiye. We can't see you, but we can hear you.
Yes.
Oh, can you not see?
We can hear you.
We can't see you, but we can
That's
hear you.
much more important. I wish it were always that way.
So we'll start by talking about, I think, our own stories and what brought us here. I've written 2 books, the first about my father's early life in East Africa. He was, within the first 25 years of his life, a child soldier, a street boy, a farmer, a musician, an illegal immigrant, and then a sailor. So his incredibly adventurous life turned me into a writer, basically. I had no ambition to write before I heard his story, and I wanted to record it in some way. My second book is based closely on my grandmother's life. We left Somalia in 1986, and she went from being a very vital, powerful woman who'd lived this very also adventurous life, actually. She got married 6 times. She was making a living as a fortune teller in Hargeisa when we left, and she was hit by a car and left paralyzed when the war broke out. So my stories come from these seeds that my family tell me. How about you, Maaza?
My book, my first book, I'm finishing my second book, is set in Ethiopia during a revolution that began in 1974. Very similar to some of the things that are happening in Egypt right now, and a bit of what's been going on in Syria happened in Ethiopia in 74. I was alive at that time. So my story springs in part from my own experiences, but I think part of the joy of fiction is being able to move beyond your own life and use your experience as a source for your imagination, but actually make it into something bigger and perhaps even more complicated. And this book is set entirely in Ethiopia. My second novel, I don't want to say too much about it, but it's set during World War II. And again, it's in Ethiopia, but it's also in Italy. And my characters are Ethiopian and Italian and also British, because the British were involved in, towards the end, in getting Italians out of Ethiopia when the Italians invaded in 1935.
How about you, Tai?
My first novel, Ghana Must Go, is probably, unlike your works, Nadifa and Maaza, the least autobiographical of the lot. I came to write very young, before I knew very much about my family history, and it's always been my greatest passion. So I suppose I always knew that it was just a matter of time before I finally got around to writing a novel. And when I did, this particular family, the Sai family, composed of a father from Ghana, a mother from Nigeria, and 4 very hard-striving children, ended up being the vessel, I think, that took me into full-length fiction. But I don't see my work as an exercise in autobiography, neither in I don't even think in history keeping. Though I agree with you so much, Maaza, that using fiction as opposed to, say, memoir or even biography opens up worlds that no other form I know of can access.
Taiye, I have a question for you, in part because I think writing my own, writing this first book and realizing that I was forming a family different from my own, even though it was set during this period that we were familiar with. I kept going back to my family, asking them questions, trying to find out about family history. Something, you talking about that just struck me now. And I wondered, I was surprised at things I found out that I never knew about my family over the course of writing this book, even if it didn't go into the book. And I wondered if you had a similar experience.
Yes and no. I've often said about the Sai family that they are based very loosely on my family, but only in demographic ways. So my father's from Ghana, so is Kweku Sai, my mother's from Nigeria, so is Folashade. But my own family is so, some of them are there in the audience. Nelly, Gary, Saffron, raise your hands. But my own family is so complex. We like your grandmother, Nadifa, we like remarriage. So we have a lot of different branches to...
What's the record for your family?
For a single woman or a single man? I think my father probably takes the cake in terms of the diversified portfolio approach to childbearing. But anyway, the point is, my own family is so sprawling, and their entanglement with political history, with the civil wars and the world ones that have occasioned the movements that have dropped them off in different parts of the globe, are actually the least of what makes this group of people so interesting. I think our romantic entanglements are much more complex and much more interesting in the end than our historical ones. So my whole life I've been asking questions about how this person became my stepdad or my ex-stepdad or the ex-wife or the new wife of the last stepdad. You know, this has been my personal experience. And I think that as a result, when I write, I'm thinking more about human relationships than I am about political ones. And to answer your question, Maaza, it's an ongoing excavation, one that began long before the novel and one that will continue long after.
Okay. Well, something that brings us together, apart from the fact that we're all novelists, is that we're Africans in a more complicated sense of the word than you'd expect. I was born in Somalia but raised in the UK.
Yeah, and I was born in Ethiopia and raised in the US.
And you're...
And I was born in London and raised everywhere.
So we're all writing about an Africa that we don't live in at the moment.
Right.
Why is that? Why are we not writing about the lives that we lead right now?
Well, I think, Nadifa, if I may, I think that question presupposes that an author should be writing about the life that he or she is leading now. And I don't think that's true at all of a novelist. I mean, again, we are by self-selection not memoirists nor journalists, even though I know that both of you write very, very cogent nonfiction as well. So I think when we're looking at the novel, we have to remember that there's a reason that we're telling stories. There's a delight that we derive from making it up. And I think that the risk, when I first saw the name of this panel, 3 Women, 3 Africa, I will not hide the fact that I did heave a heavy sigh, because I resist the tendency to look at African novelists in particular as if all of us were sort of social scientists or political historians in novelist clothing. We're telling stories, and there's nothing about that exercise, wherever we come from, that obliges us to tell the truth.
That's very true. That's very true.
Yeah, and I do agree. I second that. I think there is that assumption that if you are born in Africa or some country, somehow that is your interest. That will be your interest from the first book to the second to the third book, and that there's not a lot of room in your imagination to expand beyond people who are different from you. And I think that can be very, very frustrating. And you see on panels that I think maybe I can speak for all of us, and please jump in, but you'll see on panels that we get put into this kind of ghettoization, ghettoized space. And I think that this is something that Indian writers have also faced, where we are writing, when I'm writing about Ethiopia in the 70s during a revolution, that is the framework from which the story comes from, but I am more concerned with what happens to a family when they're put under extreme pressure, when it seems like everything you do, you keep running into a wall and you're sitting across a table from your brother and you disagree with him in everything. What happens when you love and hate somebody? And I think those are the questions about the human condition that I am most interested in. It just so happens that war becomes a backdrop for that. But I wonder what panels we'd get put in. For example, if my third book was set in Switzerland. with Swiss.
Or Maaza, if you were a Swiss writer who happened to set a novel during the Ethiopian Civil War.
Right.
Well,
Right.
For my first book, there was a strong family theme, so I was often put in discussion with people who'd also written about their own families. But I'm now writing about the Somali dictatorship and civil war, and I'm often asked to talk about Half of a Yellow Sun, because that's seen as a book that must have been influential in some way. But the book I kept rereading was actually In the Heart of the Country by J.M. Coetzee, which is set in an indeterminate time, probably the 19th century in the Karoo Desert of South Africa. So there's a woman called Magda who's slowly going mad, and she's there with her family, or her father basically, and the servants, and the tension and the atmosphere that Coetzee created in the book is what I was trying to capture with my own novel. And I think even though the times were completely different and the locations were different, Somalia in the 1980s was also like that pressure cooker of just people going mad and things falling apart all around them.
Taiye, can I ask, I think Nadifa actually leads into something very interesting. Was there a book that you were reading as you were writing yours, or something that you held in your mind as you were progressing with your novel?
It's a wonderful question. Unfortunately, when I'm writing fiction, I find myself utterly unable to read it. The best I can do is sort of slog my way through a short story, but when I'm actually doing the work, I'm completely unable to read anything, which is why, as soon as I finished my novel, I became a kind of book junkie. I read everything that I could get my hands on, including, Nadifa, I should say, The Orchard of Lost Souls, which is to my mind, such an incredibly gorgeous book, much less about civil war and much more about womanhood and different definitions and different in embodiments of womanhood in the face of incredible struggle. But what if I may, what I love that you're pointing to with that question, are there other books that were more of a guide, is the fact that what makes our novels, any novelist's novels, but ours because we're here, most poignant, I don't think is the country in which they're set, but the circumstances. And I've said before that I wish books written about civil war and what a civil war can do to a family, how civil war in and of itself is in a certain sense symbolic of the breakdown of a family. I wish books about civil war would be grouped together, regardless of where they're set. I wish books about dysfunctional families and soldiers and lovers and teachers and relationships of all stripes would be grouped together, rather than this rather outdated practice that we cling to, especially at book festivals, this business of grouping writers together based on the continent from which they come.
That's good.
We're having one of our momentary lulls. It will pass.
I know.
So you were talking, we kind of swapped. Your first book, Maaza, was set in the 1970s in the dictatorship,
yes.
And now you're working on the Second World War.
Yes.
And my first book was on the Second World War, and then
Yeah.
I swapped to the dictatorship. But one of the things we talked about the last time we met was the fact that we're interested in female bodies.
Yes.
And we were just in the panel beforehand, we were talking about Muslim women and their bodies. And often, as black women or as Muslim women or as African women, you're talked about in terms of your body. And how do you both reflect on that?
Well, you know, I'm especially involved with this question, with the really complicated role that gender plays in war. And because the second book is set during the fascist invasion of Ethiopia, and my characters, half of my characters are Italian soldiers, and so in Ethiopia, as just like everywhere else, war breeds biracial children, and I have some of them in my own family, people who are half Italian, and I've always wondered what that means, what that meant to my great aunts to have children who were Italian, and what does that mean? What did it mean to these Italian men to have children who were black? And how do you negotiate as a soldier the fact that you are in a relationship with this woman and you are sleeping with her at night, this black body next to you, but you wake up and you march to the front lines and you will shoot people that look like her and that look like your children. And there's a complexity there that I'm fascinated by, and I don't know the answer, but I'm grappling with it with my soldiers, and also coming to terms with the complexity of these men, and they're not all evil, and they had a capacity to love, and they loved some of these children, and I have stories about that, but at the same time I'm negotiating what it means to be at war. So the female in conflict, in times of conflict, I think it's an interesting question, and what did these women feel, and how do they negotiate their own space when they're serving a meal to this Italian man, but their brother is fighting against those same people. It's happening.
Maaza,
Yeah.
could I comment on that?
Absolutely.
I love what you say in the context of conflict, but I have to say, as you know, and I should tell the audience, I live in Rome right now in Italy, and that inherent contradiction, that inherent tension that you point to in the context of war persists even now in Italian culture. the fetishization of the black woman's body, of the black woman's everything, quite frankly, known very well to any vaguely brown-skinned woman who has ever tried to walk down the streets of Rome, is in such obvious tension with a hugely racist, anti-immigration sentiment in that country that I found myself lately doing a lot of nonfiction writing in Italian, actually, about just this. How the Italian man, in particular, reconciles within himself his profound and oft-studied, oft-commented upon, and from personal experience, I can say, completely exaggerated desire of the brown woman with, on the other hand, his equally passionate desire to dominate or obliterate the black male body, the black male presence. This for me is a tension that persists and perplexes.
And it's something that I wrote about in Black Mamba Boy, where my father was a child within the fascist army, the Italian fascist army in Eritrea. And it was a point in time where an Italian could kill an African and just leave 50 lira on his body for the burial. No questions asked. So it's something I thought about a lot, and my father was left with no kind of resentment or anger towards Italians, partly because of the complexity you talk about. People were often kind to him. He'd go to Italy after the war and be welcomed into people's homes. And I think the flavour of the racism there had a slightly different flavour to what he found in the UK or in America. So there's this schizophrenic, I think.
More olive oil.
Yeah. Schizophrenic attitude that cuts across racism, full stop, or casteism or classism. It's just, there's an intimacy along with a abiding contempt or fear.
Yeah, absolutely. I think.
So what are you working on now, Taiye?
Oh, speaking of Italy, a love story set in Italy, actually, where I wonder if this means that I'm not going to get to sit on panels of African writers anymore. But I've been living in Rome for 2 years, and it's a bit strange. I went to Rome to finish a novel about West Africa, and now it seems that I might soon be leaving Rome to finish a love story set in Italy. I should work on that, but that's the next one. Ready to tackle the greatest war of all.
I think when we're talking about, I really would like at some point to hear from the audience, because I feel like when we're discussing this kind of, the complicated, intimacy that existed between Italian men and African women, or their idea of it, my sense is that there are people in this audience that could probably speak about the British and Indian relationships and the complexities and the intimacies there. I'd be fascinated. I would love to hear that. I think colonialism, occupation, the dynamics of power in many ways tend to reveal themselves in similar ways. If I have my own family stories, I bet you do too, of what it was like under colonial rule. And I feel like if we could learn to expand, like you're saying, Taiye, and like you're saying, Nadifa, if we can learn to expand our dialogue beyond continent, beyond that, and actually subject matter, why couldn't Taiye sit on a panel about love with writers from the Middle East and from Scandinavia and from America? Why couldn't that be a conversation? And what does love mean for those writers? I mean, I think that would be a fascinating dialogue. I don't want to talk too much, but
I think just to interrupt, sorry. Yeah. I think the problem is that we're often, us three we're talked about as if we're presenting a particular experience, while another person, normally a European male, is talking about the general experience of humanity. Yeah. And I think that's at heart the problem.
Well, Nadifa, beyond that even, I couldn't agree with you more, but there's something even beyond that. There's the idea that a civil war in Somalia or a civil war in Ethiopia, a civil war in Nigeria is proceeding the way it is because of the Nigerianness, the fundamental primitive chaotic Somalianness, Ethiopianness of the characters involved. The unwillingness to contextualize these things in human behavior, in human motivation, in human complication, and at times in human ugliness, I think speaks to an unwillingness to understand most generally the problems that African nation states face within broader psychological, emotional, and historical contexts. I find those to shock me when things are described. Even when I'm in India, you know, someone will say, oh, this didn't work because that's how it goes in India. The train's late because that's how it goes in India. Look at this ridiculous, illogical traffic. Oh, this is because we're in Delhi. And I think, have you ever been to Rome? You see exactly the same things in Italy and
or London.
And quite frankly,
London's often the same.
Exactly. And you know, the question for me becomes, why do we seek to explain these things with recourse to some imagined essential character of brown people, as opposed to looking at what is universal and not always beautiful? I don't use universal necessarily as a triumphant word here, but what is universal about human beings? Ultimately, and I will stop my rant presently. Ultimately, I think this is why fiction is so powerful, because I can pick up Jonathan Franzen's The Corrections and see my Psy family in those pages, and you, Nadifa, can pick up Kutsia's novel set so long ago and see not the particulars of the war that you're describing, but the ways in which it tears human lives apart. This for me is why we write fiction, and we make a huge mistake when we forget that that's why we read it too.
But okay, can I bring us back to something that's happened in London recently, where there was a shooting of a guy called Mark Duggan, and he was a gangster apparently, and was smuggling guns across London. He was shot dead by the police. A court case recently acquitted any of the police of problems, of actually murdering him. And it caused a stir in London because there seemed to be a clear distinction between people from the same background as Mark Duggan saying, this is not right, he wasn't armed when he was killed, this is just another example of police brutality and of a segregated society, while another section of society was saying, no, he deserved everything he got, the police are there to do their job, and it doesn't matter if he was armed at the moment, at that particular moment, he had a gun, that's enough justification. So we've had black literature since the 1930s, and I think in a strong way. But what this conversation revealed to me was there's not much has been achieved. We could go straight back to the 1930s and the conversation is exactly the same. So maybe fiction isn't as powerful as we want it to be.
Well, fiction can only reflect the society that it's seeking to describe, no? The extent to which fiction can change those societies, I think, is always mitigated by time, alas.
But can we keep
Yeah,
on?
I mean, I think what you, and this idea that, well, here's something else though, Nadifa, I think when I'm writing fiction, I'm not there to prove a point. I'm not necessarily there to make a political statement. Like Taiye was saying, it's about telling a story. When I'm writing I'm writing this second book in the time of Trayvon Martin, right? And I'm very well aware of the world from which I write and live. But because he existed, because that situation existed, I don't think it negates the effect that fiction has or can have. I don't think it's the role of a black writer to write fiction that is trying to, it's not an obligation to address racism. I mean, frankly, just like as a writer born in Africa, I am not obligated to write about the continent from which I come. I'm only obligated to write where my imagination leads me. But I think that that's what you're saying. We have had these discussions as a group, as a community of Black writers. What is the role of the writer in a politically charged country? What is the role of fiction when it seems that what you are writing is so frivolous in the face of violence or in the face of racism? Can you write, and Taiye, you know, this is what I really love about your second book is it's a love story. Can you write a love story as a Black woman? Is that possible? I was on a panel in Amsterdam with a group of writers from Africa, and this question rose up: Can an African write a love story?
In what context?
In the sense that one of the writers, who was a very well-known writer, said that when she writes a love story, the publishers don't accept it. When she writes a book about violence, they run for it, they grab it. And so her position was, why am I obligated to write about violence if that's not what I want to do? And then someone else on the panel said, well, how can you, as an African, completely erase the political context of the country in which you live or the people? How can you take country out of a story? Can you take politics out of it as an African writer? Needless to say, that panel erupted in, you know, and I feel like that's what I'm hearing you, I think that's what I'm hearing you say also. This little boy was shot and killed. What is your obligation? What is your obligation, or what is the role of fiction in stopping that? And I am saying that our obligation is only to imagination and story.
I wouldn't say obligation. It's not in terms of obligation, it's in terms of failure. A failure either for people to communicate or a failure for people to absorb. That's what I find disturbing. If we are meant to be talking about our unique experiences, but also bringing together the universalities of our experiences, then why isn't this happening here? Where is there the breakdown? Are people...
Nadifa, could I suggest something?
Mm-hmm.
I think that you're absolutely right to point to the entrenched forms and the violent forms of racism, and said more specifically, the utter disregard for the value of the lives of brown women and men in the West. It's shocking. We're seeing, I think, at this moment, expressions of this all over the world, and it's shocking, I agree. What can fiction do? I think is your question. And while I don't think, I'm not so naive as to proclaim that reading novels will heal the world, I think that when you think about what effect a novel has on a single reader, that's where I think you find reason to hope. When that boy's mother found out that her child had been killed in cold blood by the state, much like Trayvon Martin's mother, she obviously had a reaction that most mothers in the world can relate to. If that were fictionalized, if that were brought to me as a reader in the form of a novel, in the density of prose and the immediacy of language, I am sure that I, common with most readers, would suddenly see that situation different. Not as a question of black, white, right, wrong, police, civilian, so forth, but in terms of the loss of human life. And I think that that's what a novel can do. That's the best that a novel can do, and it's so much to bring us into immediate contact with the consequences, the lived consequences of the actions of the state in the lives of a human being. If you think of that happening one by one, but when one becomes thousands and thousands become millions, then I think we can imagine the novel as changing the way individual human beings think. Does that make sense?
It does. And I think
Maybe it's that police need to read more novels.
Maybe you revealed my fear, and my fear is that people can read our books, put them aside, and it won't even leave an imprint at all. They'll relate to the same young black boy they see on the bus, who could be Jama, who could be one of your characters, who could be one of your characters, and they won't see that. They'll just see another bogeyman that they read about in the newspapers or see on the television.
But let's say one person on the train has that reaction, but 5 don't. I think fiction has done something, and I think it's done something worth celebrating.
I'll accept that. How much longer do we have?
Yeah, how much? I want to.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
From my sick bed here in Delhi. I've been wondering, I wrote an essay recently. It was actually a speech I gave in Berlin, and it was called African Literature Doesn't Exist. And in this probably the title is much more inflammatory than the text itself. But I was wondering why we continue to talk about the African writer. When we were in Chennai in Kolkata, touring with the British Council, I asked all of my Indian audiences if they could name whichever African writers came to mind. And I don't take this the wrong way, but most of them came from Nigeria. There was a lot of Achebe and Adichie and Soyinka and Cole, but there were also writers from all over the continent. But I asked the question, why don't we talk about Nigerian writers? Why don't we talk about West African writers? If needs must, if we insist upon bringing nation into it, why don't we at least honor the huge diversity found on the African continent by speaking about region? And better yet, why don't we just kind of do away with the whole thing? And I started wondering, why do we do this? What does it actually mean to be an African writer, or for that matter, an Indian writer, or a Pakistani writer, or a Sri Lankan writer, an American writer, a Chinese writer? What does this actually mean, and why do we insist upon speaking this way? I'd love it if you two or anyone in the audience could help me understand what is gained by thinking about something as free from boundaries as fiction within such bounded terms.
I know, I sometimes feel like an actress almost, being an African writer, because I'm probably more of a British writer. I've grown up in the UK, and the books that I've read and the way that I see fiction is from a British perspective. But I'm writing stories set in Africa, so my stories are African. I don't know if I'm an African writer, and that can open up the whole idea of what does it mean to be African in the first place. It's a new idea. I don't think my grandmother would understand the concept of Africa.
Right.
She was her clan first, then Somali, Muslim would be in that mix somewhere, then she would belong to a particular part of the world, the Horn of Africa. So she would have very little contact with someone from Ghana or someone from Zimbabwe.
Right.
So it's probably people of our generation that have really started thinking of ourselves as Africans. And there were Pan-Africanists in the 60s who preceded us. But I feel very comfortable calling myself an African, even though I've grown up outside of the continent. So it's a shorthand for something. Yeah. I don't know what it's a shorthand for, but it's for something.
Yeah, I mean, in the very short answer, I think, to the question that Taiye is asking, is that it's much easier for the publishing company to group under something large and vague, and you can fill up many bookshelves if you have Africa. And it's just easier. It's shorthand. People go to that section because they have an idea of what they think an African book is like, and you know exactly where to go in the bookstore, and it's much easier to make the sale, and it's much easier to advertise. I mean, it's a very much a question of commercialism. African literature.
Well, what is an African book like? Does there have to be a civil war, famine, a desert? What are we talking about? What is the criteria for African nobleness?
Yeah, I think that's, but I'm not saying that that's right. I'm saying I think that that's what people think about when they decide to head towards this section of a bookstore to pick up. They want to read something very different from the kind of life that they had and they have, and maybe this is it. I live in the U.S. I count myself, I am American. I have, if you set me in Ethiopia, Ethiopians will say I am American. If you set me in Kenya, they may say I am Ethiopian. If I am in the US, I identify as Ethiopian American. And it is almost, to me, like trying to say, I mean, someone asked me, well, are you American or are you Ethiopian? You're asking me, am I my father's child or am I my mother's child? When I am actually the creation of both. And so what does an African book look like? It might look like this, which is something I've written, but I look at it also as an American book because the definitions of what it means to be American, what it means to be British, have to expand, and we are doing it. But the publishing industry is a little bit slow in catching up with the rest of us.
I'm happy you say that, Maaza, because when you say Nadifa, I'm a British writer. I've been as much influenced by British writing. I would assume that you mean by British something quite diverse unto itself.
Yes.
No?
Yes.
Okay. Just checking because I mean, this idea that Britishness or Americanness, centerness remains sort of untouched, while all of the outside and the otherness remains removed. I also find problematic. I asked a writer in Chandigarh, what is the common Indian language spoken in India? And she said English. And I said, no, I mean an Indian language. And she said English. and then I got it. I was like, of course, yeah, English is an Indian language as much as it is a Nigerian language, as much as it is a Ghanaian language. So that Britishness that we speak of, let's always remember that it has become very browned over time.
It has. When I say British, I quite naturally include Indian fiction in that. Yeah. You know, I grew up reading books set in India in a way that, for me, I think it was also like a surrogate thing. India became a surrogate Somalia for me in books. But then in the last 5 years, when there has been a surge of writing by African women, I can't help but say that there is an immediacy when I read those books. I know what you're saying without any effort, you know, in the same way that if I read a book by just Ian McEwan, I have to work my way into his consciousness. Yeah. I don't have to do that with your writing or your writing. Yeah. There is an immediacy, there is a connection which was lacking in my life before.
Nadifa, maybe that's just because we're better writers.
I didn't want to say that, but...
It is an option. I think all good writing is immediately accessible. I really do, and that doesn't mean to say that it should be simple. But I think that the writing that is inaccessible, be it written, whatever the color or gender of the author, has missed something. I genuinely believe that. I think that good writing per force must reach a reader, not all readers, but it must.
Maybe it has to be amazing to get beyond those differences. Well, you can pick up a book, and if it's speaking to your experience, you don't have to make that huge jump.
But I still, I still hold books written by so-called African writers to the same standards.
Taiye is talking.
Taiye is talking?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Taiye. Is she talking?
No, I'm not speaking. I'm listening.
Okay.
Attentive.
Maybe it's an interesting point that one type of book has to be absolutely excellent to get into, and maybe another one that is more connected to your experience may not have to be as good. But I want to disagree with that respectfully.
Yes.
Because I hold books to the same standards. When I go to pick up a book written by, let's say, a writer from, let's say your book, I hold it to the same standard as if I were reading Ian McEwan or E.L. Doctorow or any of these other writers that I've read, because the world of fiction is supposed to connect. It's beyond just experience. We're talking about something visceral and emotional, and sometimes I don't have to have E.L. Doctorow's experience, but when I read Ragtime or when I read The March about the American Civil War, I connect to those characters in a way that is so strong. And it's because I understand whatever complexities and conflicts those characters have. I expect the same from a book from my country or from the continent. I think we have to hold ourselves to task in that way.
I'm interested in your supposed to, that it's supposed to do that.
What do you mean supposed to?
Earlier you said that, I think you said it's supposed to do this. And I understand what you mean. It's supposed to make you connect in a way that it blurs all of the boundaries between you and the writer. But in the last 50 years or so, we've had critics and authors from the same background who really understand there's been this symbiotic relationship between how they see the world, their own expectations of it, their own place in it. So when I read a book by someone or a book about a professor, an elderly professor who's infatuated with one of his young students, and these books appear and appear and appear, I don't feel anything for that. While a young African or American African, British African student in an Ivy League university or something like that, I can understand that experience. So maybe there's a bit of dishonesty here.
Well, maybe it's also taste. I mean, isn't that also what we're talking about?
But taste is formed by your background and by who you are and your experiences and the things you read. And if there's a British critic who barely reads African fiction, then their taste is going to be, that relationship, that understanding, that sympathy is harder to form.
Yeah, I mean, that I agree with. I think we run across it. We do run across it when critics read our books, and you can tell the ones who know something about the history that we're writing about or the story that we're telling. You can tell the difference in the level of criticism, the depth of the analysis, the types of writers that critic will compare you to.
Exactly, yes.
Which becomes they're not looking just, the critics who really understand, let's say, my book, would not put me on a list of post-colonial writers because they understand something about Ethiopian history or the story that I'm telling. And I think that you see it happening all the time. I had a friend of mine who wrote a book set in Morocco, and the person who reviewed her book was someone who normally reviewed cookbooks. And
she was Moroccan.
She's Moroccan. Well, no, the reviewer was not Moroccan. Not in any. So, my friend calls me up saying, "What the hell is this?"
Yeah.
I said, "Oh man," and you could tell. So this happens a lot. This is just another layer that we contend with.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And
But I think that one of the things that we must do, we three, our kind, readers and writers alike, is to start rejecting this. I have to say, I don't think that a reviewer needs to know anything about Ethiopian history to appreciate the book, but I think she just needs to know something about how to read well. I genuinely mean that. I'm always asked to review books now written by anyone from any country on the African continent, as if I should be authority on them all. And I just read this wonderful book called Dust by a Kenyan author, Yvonne Owuor, and I started the review by saying, I've never been to Kenya in my life. I've been to East Africa, and the whole time I ate samosa and chana masala. I mean, I know much less about East Africa than the average New York Times reader, but I think I know everything I need to know about people to love this book. And all I'm suggesting is I think we need to insist as writers and readers alike that our entry point to fiction is the human being. It doesn't, we've been reading books about the white male experience in the United States and the UK, for our entire upbringing. I don't really know what it's like to be a white man, but I still get into these books. I still love them with all my heart. I still adore Great Gatsby and Brideshead Revisited. I love these books. I love Calvino. I love God of Small Things. I love it all. I love White Tiger. And I don't need to know that much. And if I'm missing something, that's why there's Google. But what really should be connecting us all, the text that we take the time to read, is our sense of the people, is our sense of the stories, and our sense of the selves, ourselves, that we find there.
Thank you. Could we have a few questions?
Are there no questions?
We're just getting the mic to the audience.
Hello, this was a very interesting panel. By the way, I'm Zakaria from Morocco. And I want to get back to like this ghettoization in panels, in literary festivals. Like maybe before thinking about like a panel about Africa, maybe shouldn't you have asked yourself maybe what kind of Africa they want to put you in? Because isn't it more of a black Africa, you know, sub-Saharan Africa, disregarding North Africa, which is again expanding the meaning of what it means to be African, you know, closer to a bridge between Africa and other places like Europe, obviously. So I want you like just to respond to that.
You're absolutely right that when we speak of Africa, we leave out North Africa, and
often leave out the Horn of Africa.
Absolutely, we leave out. We're left out.
It's basically Nigeria.
Yeah, it's just you and me. And but it is a problem. My friend, who's a Moroccan writer, she's constantly, we'll go to a bookstore sometimes, she'll move it from her books from the Middle East section and put them, you know, in Africa. Because it not just with the publishing, but other sub-Saharan African countries may not see North Africa as really part of that continent. And you're absolutely right, and we need to expand the discussion just the way that I'm saying that we need to expand what it means to be American and British. We also need to expand what it means to be African, because when I was in Ethiopia just recently, I cannot tell you how many Chinese are there that now speak Amharic. Shocked, I'm shocked. And I was on a train I was on the metro, the subway in New York this year, maybe 6-7 months ago, and an Indian man came up to me on the train and spoke in fluent Amharic. I said,
Was it Abraham Baghazi?
It was not Abraham Baghazi. But we have these histories, we have this connection. I just spoke with a man after this other panel I did this morning, and we're talking about Goa. And I swear we have Ethiopians in Goa, you know, because when I see someone from Goa, they look like my cousin. And so we haven't begun these conversations of what it means to be Indian or what it means to be American. And you're right, when we get on these types of panels, we forget our North African brothers. I'm so sorry.
You know, Maaza, we forget everything that doesn't fall into, you know, Binya's picture of Africa. If there aren't dying or starving children, wise elder people, walking sticks, big trees, dust, it's not Africa. It's just we're thinking of a tiny little Disney image when we employ this term, and we should just do away with it.
Maybe we should do like a Lion King thing. And when we do panels, we make sure that we have like a performance and masks and a whole thing ready.
Definitely, I would feel better if they could play Ladysmith Black Mamboza before every panel. That would make me feel very, very comfortable. Or live drumming.
Hi. My question was to do with the autobiographical nature of writing that somewhere comes in both Indian and African writing that at least I have read. I haven't read much, but do correct me if I'm wrong. I was saying that even though like your novels would not be autobiographical in nature and form, both Africans and Indians, and we somehow have this need to establish our space in say the global scenario. Like we need to establish our identity as what our culture really is, and who we are. So where does fiction and autobiographical nature of writing sort of combine and give a literary thing?
Well, for me, just to give an example, Somali women and Somali men, to be honest, are often written about, talked about, and represented by people who aren't them. So just doing it is, just writing yourself is a way of saying, this is who I am, this is who my father was, this is who his friends were. So that's a way of carving out a space for yourself. Writing is a way of doing that. Yeah. On a very basic level.
Yeah, and I think with fiction, you may start from an experience, and that may inspire a story, but to really create a book with hundreds of pages, you have to move beyond that, and you actually have to make things up and use your imagination. So I always say, I may start from experience, but I don't stay there. I move beyond it.
And do you find that lots of things bubble up to the surface?
Yeah.
Something that I might have read in a newspaper when I was 15, an image that comes up, and I don't even know, if it's from a dream or from a film or from something that I saw. So a novel is a very particular outpouring of who you are.
Yeah.
And yet, at the same time, it's such outpouring. It is, but it's not a diary. Seamus Heaney, who we so recently lost, said that autobiographical content is not the point of writing per se, but rather the shape-making impulse. And I love this language that he uses, this idea of making a shape. Maaza, I think it's what you're saying, that the desire to tell your story or your mother's story or your father's story will get you from about, I think, page 1 to 9. From page 9 to 350, you're going to need a shape-making impulse. And I think that's what makes fiction ultimately so very beautiful.
But how do you make that shape, both of you?
That is the question of our time, my friend. I always quote Leonard Cohen on this, because somebody asked him, where do his songs come from? And he said, if I knew where they came from, I'd go there more often. But that's how I feel. Who has any idea where these things come from? Who has any idea where the not the inspiration for the story, but the flow from one sentence to the next, one chapter to the next? I think it's all kind of magic.
I think that's a great place to stop.
I think with this, we come to this wonderful session. We had Taiye Selasi 100% with us, and a big applause to our technical team there. Thank you so very much. And thank you, Nadifa. It was wonderful.